Now, where would you start when it comes to big theory or big pictures? You might have like no idea what to imagine here, what I'm talking about. And I think a really useful way to illustrate this is the distinction between two different thinkers, Habermas and Luhmann. And it has been said that what makes what's different in their approaches is that supposedly Habermas is more of a hermeneutic thinker. He's more person-oriented or thinker-oriented, while on the other hand, it has been said that Luhmann is more of a systemic thinker in a way. He's more problem-oriented, and it's something that supposedly you can see in their bibliographies. So when you're reading Habermas' bibliographies, you will see primarily other people listed in their integrity of point of view. So he's not taking just one source and quoting it, but he usually takes their major works that cover the entire oeuvre of their thinking. So he's thinking in worldviews, and the worldview comes as a unified whole. And to get a worldview and to grasp a worldview, you really have to take everything that the person has been saying, their entire oeuvre, and study it. This is the more person-oriented or hermeneutic approach that Habermas is taking. And Luhmann, on the other hand, if you look at his bibliographies, is more problem-oriented. So he has no problem in quoting fragments or single individual works, as long as they have something specific to say about the problem that then stands within a bigger picture. No, both of them are systemic thinkers in the way that both of them are, as I already mentioned, thinking of the world in terms of framework questions. They are not trying to isolate questions, but they see that questions are always embedded in much bigger frameworks that have to be covered and are related to whatever kind of specific single question you pick out, and you have to cover the entire framework if you want to get anywhere. Both of them are systemic in this sense, and yet their focus, just to use an illustration, is different. The one is more oriented around rebuilding, reconstructing a specific worldview of a person. The other one is more interested in specific problems and dealing with those and fitting those together into a bigger map. And I think this is the two ways of approaching big think or grand narrative that we can take. So on the one hand, what we will need is big authors that we orient ourselves on, or that we follow. And that's something that you can see also in many philosophers in their own development of thinking. It's usually the case that most philosophers have a few truly important influences, individuals, for their own thinking. And it's usually half a dozen or so people. Like 3 to 5 thinkers that have really had significant impact on their own kind of thinking. And the rest is like filling the gaps. The rest is like, of course, they know much more people, but it's usually the case that they study 3 to 5 people really well and read everything that they have written and really delve into the entirety of their worldview. So we might start with that, for example, for cosmologists to make explicit which the major opinion leaders for them are, on which they orient their worldview, and make that transparent to others. And we can also ask people who are already established cosmologists out there for their major influences or major sources on which they're building their own conceptual framework. And what I'm talking about here is really the major figures that are most definitive on their own way of thinking about problems. This is the one area where we can really start to gather for each and every individual their own preferences as to who they really rely most when it comes to creating big frameworks. And usually these people that they will then quote will be themselves cosmologists. It will be people like Whitehead, or it will be people like Gebser, and not someone who is specialized in a very specific problem. Because these thinkers, again, already are thinking in such frameworks and framework questions. So they really lend themselves to creating an entire cosmos, to creating an entire worldview, and not only to face a specific specialized problem that then you can grapple with. That's the one way of approaching it. The other one is to try to flesh out the topics, the problems that are really relevant to big think. Because here again, you can't just take any topic and think it is relevant. It's not equally relevant. The problem of attention, for example, is a more relevant problem, then I don't know, take any kind of example, any kind of specific problem, like how to fix a bicycle, for example. This is not implicitly, evidently related to cosmology. The knowledge that you bring forth for maintaining a motorbike, for example, unless you bring in it some kind of weird twist into it and make it a spiritual endeavor or whatnot. But there are central problems to cosmology, problems like, for example, what do we consider to be collective intentionality? How does collective intentionality work? How does consciousness, attention work? There are central problems. So fleshing those out is the other approach that we can take to big theory, so that those who study flesh out the major problems, the major regions which they feel they have to cover in the course of their lifespan and in the time to come. And here the same thing. Ask like leading opinion leaders, like, I don't know, Wilbur or other ones who have been established so far. Ask them for the topics that they really think we have to cover systematically. One of the topics I'm pretty sure we'll have to cover is addiction, because addiction is something that crosses so many different domains and has so many different forms and implications. It's just not possible to be integrally informed without knowing anything about addiction. Another one of these problems, which is crucially important and you have to be informed about, is meaning making. You have to understand how we create meaning and how we get from specific sources to meaningful statements and claims about reality. If you don't grasp that, in other words, if you don't understand the notion of the quadrants in integral theory or different perspectives or the idea of validity claims, if you don't get that, you just can't really do any kind of grand theory, because you will be self-forgotten. You will be just thinking about the world. You will not be able to think about your own thinking processes. This is another topic that you have to cover, whatever kind of integral theory you come up with, however interesting or different it might be from the kind of integral theory that Ken Wilber came up with. You have to cover this very topic. So we have on the one hand the topics, and on the other hand the major opinion leaders. And what we could then do with the help of software, we could easily visualize for each and every individual perspective, for each and every individual cosmologist that is using the platform, we could visualize what their major influences are, what the major opinion leaders are that have had consequential influences on their worldviews on the one hand, and on the other hand, you would make more transparent which the major topics are that they have already covered in their own thinking. And I think you see where all of this is going. In making transparent the sources of your thinking, in making transparent what you're basing your world experience on, you yourself become much more comprehensible to those around you, and it's also much more easy to spot what you have left out, what you have not paid so much attention to, and it's much more easy to spot if some kind of opinion is not so well grounded. And I think you can see the connection to what is going on in our everyday experience of being bombarded with not so well-founded opinions, or what is running as fake news today. The problem with fake news, the major problem with fake news is that it's already formed opinions that we are confronted with. It's opinions where we don't know the sources, and it's impossible to really track the sources where this opinion has actually been formed for the first time. Maybe it was an individual, maybe it was a secret agency. You just don't know where this opinion comes from, and you don't know what this opinion is actually based on. The actual experiences and the actual data source from which these opinions surrounding us originate is invisible. But if we make visible these sources, it becomes much more easy for people to actually track them and see as to how it stands with their validity, how likely it is for them to be really trustworthy opinions, or just opinions that are attempts to manipulate you. So I think you can immediately see how what would be happening in this closed area where integralism is being trained, how this is deeply related to what is happening in society at large, and how this kind of structural change, this is to force people to make transparent the sources that they're basing their opinions on, how this might have global implications of how we actually, how we proceed with being informed and taking up information that is surrounding us. It's something that so far is pretty much has not been integrated in social media so far. There is no function that really allows it for you to easily see where the actual source of a specific idea lies and what the hidden motivation of actually forming the specific idea actually is. And that's also something that will become increasingly more difficult to fake. You can fake opinions. You can just create, you can easily create a meme, but it's much more difficult to fake persons. This is to fake an entire worldview that stands behind a specific opinion with its own reasons, with its own observations, with its own values. It's something that's much more difficult to fake than just a specific sentence that you then let spread out all over the internet. If you bind single opinions and single statements to persons that are visible as entire worldviews, it is much more difficult to pretend that an opinion has an opinion bearer, someone who stands behind it, if we have achieved this degree of transparency. And it's the good kind of way of transparency, because what you're making transparent is not your bank account. What you're making transparent is not when you're at home or when you're leaving your home or who your children are. What you're making transparent is this horrible word. You're making transparent the depth of your understanding. And it's something that we have no measure for so far in social media. And what social media is making transparent is often trivial details that you really wouldn't want to know and wouldn't want to see. But what we should be interested in is making depth more transparent. And that's something that's not easy. It's not something that's obvious. Think about how you could make the depth of your own perspective transparent through social media. Social media is not built for that. Social media is built for surfaces. It's built for making surfaces transparent, like seeing things that you better really wouldn't want to see about other persons. But if you think about how you would make transparent depth, it's the only way to do it so far is still telling a story. And it really depends on your personal ability to tell a story, whether you can get the depth of a perspective across or not. Just using a specific kind of medium like social media doesn't make your perspective more deep necessarily. It's usually the very opposite. It makes it tendentially more narrow and more shallow than it very likely will be. And this is a problem that we will have to systemically address. We cannot expect everyone to simply be deep. But we have to use media that forces into this depth. We have to use media that forces into complexity and not the opposite trend, which is simplification and groupthink and creating different camps that are fighting with each other.